am so excited for y'all to listen to this episode with Dr. Elisabeth Morray today. We're going to be talking about the importance of having really strong clinical skills as a therapist if you want to be successful in private practice, and the role that clinical supervision and professional development takes in making you a better therapist. Elisabeth is a licensed psychologist who's done amazing work in her career as a therapist, in leadership, and facilitating continuing education training in acceptance and commitment therapy to thousands of licensed clinicians. She's currently VP of Clinical at Alma, a platform that supports the practices of over 24,000 behavioral health clinicians. Let's dive in. Hi, Elisabeth. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes. So I talk a lot on this podcast about different marketing techniques to really help therapists fill their caseload in private practice. But one thing that I don't think that we talk about enough is just how important it is to be a really great therapist if you actually want to be successful in private practice, right? Like really strong clinical skills that serve your clients super well, helps you retain your clients and get word of mouth referrals. So I'm super excited to kind of chat with you about that today and the role that clinical supervision and professional development kind of plays in all of that.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
So I think with clinical supervision, a lot of therapists sort of think of that as the required hours that you need to get your license. But what does clinical supervision mean to you as a therapist, and why do you think it's important?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because as therapists, we certainly are very familiar with the idea that our role is to help our clients continue to grow and expand and evolve and develop skills that they might not have had before coming to therapy. And so the idea that we wouldn't want or maybe even need to continue to do that ourselves as we continue to evolve as therapists is kind of a funny one. And just as I think we offer to our clients a relationship and a space that is really devoted to their learning, I think there can be something incredibly powerful for us as clinicians about having a space that is devoted to our clinical development and our professional identity.
Totally. Are you a clinical supervisor for other therapists yourself, or?
I have been for probably about the past 10 years of my career. A little bit less so now, just given my primary role doesn't put me in as much contact with trainees, but I actually directed a postgraduate fellowship. So I have lots of experience in that space. And it's really one of the things that I'm most passionate about in terms of my professional role.
Very cool. How do you sort of see therapists utilizing supervision differently throughout their careers? I know when I was pre-licensed, right, it was very like case review. It didn't feel necessarily super in-depth clinically. It felt much more like, let's make sure that we are doing everything correctly, like we're not missing any big red flags. How does that sort of change, I guess, through a therapist's own professional development?
Yeah, the way I think about it is that when we are in training, we need someone to provide oversight, right? We are still learning, we are still figuring things out, and it is ethical and probably critical that we have a more experienced, more seasoned clinician really overseeing the work we do to make sure we are really providing the best quality services to our clients.
Yep.
When we become professionals and independently licensed clinicians, it's no longer about oversight. It's no longer about someone making sure you don't do things wrong.
Yep.
It's really about perspective. It's about having someone you trust enough to provide different perspectives on the work you're doing that you couldn't possibly have yourself about you doing this work, right? You need an outside source of guidance and feedback in order to grow for most of us most of the time. And so once we become independent in terms of our licensure and our practice, getting that outside perspective can be hugely impactful in terms of helping us really fulfill our potential as
Totally.
therapists. Yeah.
I think it's so different too of like when you're working at an agency or something and your clinical supervisor is also your boss, right? Or your
Mm-hmm.
regular supervisor
Yeah.
versus, when you're fully licensed and usually you're actually paying for clinical supervision.
Mm-hmm.
I think you just approach it with such a different mindset, and such a different willingness to bring even the parts where you feel challenged, right? Because it's less about, is this person not going to think I'm good at my job, or are they going to judge me, or what's kind of going on there? And instead, you're really investing in that own space, almost similar to therapy in a way, and really trying to be much more open and honest, talk through the places where you feel stuck, talk through the places where you feel triggered or transference or whatever. And I think that that is so huge too.
Yeah, there's a very different level of ownership and intentionality. No one is forcing you to do this, right? You
Yeah,
are freely choosing to invest your time and your money into a relationship that is designed to help you grow. And so, whereas I think, when we were in training, it would not be uncommon for people to think like, what am I going to, I don't know what I'm going to talk to my supervisor about today. I'm sure I can come up with something.
yeah,
Right. And to just know that you needed to fill the hour. Um, when you are kind of contracting with someone for your own growth, I think you can really be very clear about what it is you need out of the relationship, and find people who can offer what it is that you need.
totally.
Yeah.
How do you suggest that therapists go about finding a clinical supervisor when they're in private practice?
I recommend that you think about kind of your niche as a clinician. And some people are generalists, and we can talk about like that as what kind of approach it would take if you consider yourself more kind of broad and eclectic. But for those of us who have a particular theoretical orientation, for me, that's acceptance and commitment therapy, or we tend to work with a particular diagnosis. Finding someone whose skill, whose judgment, and whose experience in that area is, hopefully, to be quite blunt, better than your own.
Yeah,
Um, and so for some people, um, that comes through kind of their network, and finding through professional organizations people who have that level of experience and expertise. For other people, it might be through continuing education, that they would identify people who are really at the cutting edge of the work that they do. And for people who maybe consider themselves a little bit more of a generalist, where they take an eclectic approach in terms of modality or theoretical orientation, or treat a really wide variety of presenting concerns, in those cases, I think you need to find someone who has a style or kind of embodies the qualities or characteristics that you aspire to in your own clinical work.
yeah,
And in some ways, the clinical supervisor is a role model, and so you do need to choose one carefully, because in an ideal scenario, in a best case circumstance, this is someone who you are going to allow to really shape the clinician you become over time, and so you want to be careful in that choice.
totally. I guess, like, do you suggest interviewing kind of multiple clinical supervisors then, or how do you sort of like make that choice?
It's not unlike what I recommend that clients do when it comes to finding a therapist.
Yeah,
Um, there are people who have an incredible CV and tons of experience, and they've published 10 million articles on a topic. But when you sit down with them, you just don't click.
yeah,
You don't have that kind of elusive chemistry. And so, given how important I think that is, in a supervisory relationship, and that you do have the opportunity to be picky in a way
yeah,
that you can't when you are being supervised by your manager or because you're in training, um, you have the opportunity to be very selective in who you choose. And really, the only way you're going to be able to do that with any kind of clarity is to set up a consultation and to get a sense of whether or not there's a good fit. And even if you have to pay for that, I think
yeah.
it's a really good investment in the relationship you're trying to build.
Totally. And I think that it's so important to just even consider, clinical supervision, professional development as part of your budget when you're starting a private
Mm,
practice, right? I think that oftentimes therapists think about, I need an electronic health record, or if they're in person, they need an office, or they need,
mhm,
the HIPAA compliant telehealth software, or whatever. But they kind of forget that, again, marketing is super, super important. That's my jam, and it's what I teach therapists all day. But if you don't have the good clinical skills to go with that, you're going to have so much turnover in your practice. And it doesn't matter how good your marketing is,
mhm.
you're never going to be able to have a successful, thriving practice if your clients are always leaving, if you're not getting word of mouth referrals, if people don't trust you enough to send you a referral. And so I think that that is just like so important to invest in and to not consider like a would be nice expense or a one day
Mhm.
I'll get there. It's super important to really make sure that that's top priority for folks.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
One thing that I personally loved about clinical supervision is just like sort of the built-in accountability too. I
Mm,
feel like especially when I first started in private practice, I was seeing, much more clients weekly than I do now. And so it always felt like I was kind of go, 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 just like between sessions. And it really forced me to slow down and like reflect on those sessions, conceptualize the cases more, think about things differently, really outside of the session with the client. And I think that that is such a powerful piece too,
yeah,
of not just relying on your own clinical instinct and judgment in the session, but actually having enough time and dedicated space to slow down and be outside of the moment with your client and really thinking about what they need.
yeah. Yeah, that's it's such a good point because I think, you know, one of the things that we hopefully build in our clients is the ability for them to access kind of our perspective as their therapist, as someone who knows them well, as someone who's coached them when they run into tough moments or kind of sticky moments in life. And I think when you have a really great relationship with a clinical supervisor, you kind of carry them around with you into
Mm-hmm.
session and between sessions where certainly, you are bringing hopefully as much of yourself as possible into the relationship and into the work, but there is this other perspective that you can access, like that you've over time begun to kind of absorb the kinds of questions they ask or the way that they would encourage you to take risks, or to lean into discomfort. And so, having a clinical supervisor, particularly one who you deeply trust, can add just a different perspective that can really inform all of the work that you do, both in session and between sessions.
Totally. I think of it too as almost like walking the walk, right? Like I truly believe that therapists should be in therapy, if not indefinitely, at least, multiple periods throughout their life. But I think that clinical supervision is similar as well, right? Like if we are going to ask our clients to show up and be super vulnerable, to process, to reflect, to like dig deeper, I really do feel like it's our responsibility as clinicians to sort of give them that same back.
Yeah, definitely.
What are your thoughts on peer supervision groups?
So, peer supervision groups can be so powerful, I think, because they often give you this sense of like, me too. That the
Yep.
things that I struggle with, the places where I get stuck, the places where I find myself becoming more rigid than I would like to be, as a person and as a clinician. That when you're in a group of people who are doing the work that you're doing, so often they will share in that experience that there is a sense of having your own struggles recognized, and also creating a sense of connection and shared vulnerability in a
Mm-hmm.
peer supervision group. And a group gives you access to multiple perspectives, right? And you might be in a group where one person has a very psychodynamic approach, and another person is more cognitive behavioral, and a third does internal family systems. And so, having all of those opportunities to get different perspectives on the work that you're doing and to learn and to potentially become more flexible in terms of what you do and how you respond, because
Totally.
you have had the chance to connect with and to kind of think through the choices you make clinically with people who may approach it in either mildly different ways or in some cases very different ways from what you would
Hmm.
do if left to your own devices.
And with like kind of finding peer supervision groups, do you suggest therapists sort of just like reach out to other friends or colleagues in the field and schedule lunch or something together? Or do you kind of prefer something more structured or formalized?
Well, I'm really lucky in my work at Alma that we create a structure in which clinicians can find other clinicians to engage in peer supervision. So, for instance, I participate regularly in an acceptance and commitment therapy peer supervision group and was able to connect with people through that platform. Um, I think professional organizations can be really helpful in terms of finding like minded clinicians, whether it's like your state licensing board and professional organization or an organization that supports a particular theoretical approach.
Yep.
It certainly can be helpful to reach out to your network, to friends and colleagues, and to see if there are people who are really looking for a similar kind of experience as you are. Um, and, there are a lot of opportunities to kind of ensure that on some level you have a shared approach to the work, which can
Yep.
then allow you to kind of build on that perspective from day one. But I think there are a lot of different ways to find a peer supervision group, and the important thing is recognizing that it may take a little bit of time. It may not
Yep.
happen overnight. That we kind of have to build these communities for ourselves, and so to expect that it will be something that you'll have to invest some time and energy into, but that it will be very well worth it in the long run.
Totally. I've been in 3 peer supervision groups since starting in private practice, and I would say the first 2 were a little bit of a bust, but the third was really positive. I think it can be challenging if you have like such a different clinical approach, or if almost like one of them, it felt like we kind of all had different purposes. Like some people more so wanted to talk about private practice building. Some people wanted to talk about like boundaries with clients in terms of like fees and cancellations and timing and stuff. And other people wanted sort of more that clinical support.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think not having that shared vision of what the group really looked like
Mm-hmm.
made it challenging for folks. But once I found a group where we were all very clear of what we were trying to do there, why we were showing up, how we wanted to show up, how we approach things with clients, I think that it's been so, so valuable.
Mm, yeah, yeah. You really articulated the things that made the group that worked different.
Yeah.
That created an experience where people were able to feel connected and to be successful in doing the work together. And like many things in life, sometimes there's trial and error.
Yep.
Sometimes you've got to have a few that don't work out quite so well before you find the one that does.
And it makes you like appreciate the one that works out more too sometimes,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
How about professional development? Where do you sort of see that falling in for therapists beyond, the
Mhm.
30 hours of continuing education requirements or whatever?
Yeah. I mean, I am very open about the fact that continuing education really altered the course of my life and my career.
Hmm.
So very early on, after I had my independent licensure, I worked for an organization that paid for continuing education, which, after you've been a postdoc for years, like the idea that anyone wants to pay for you to do anything is like mind blowing. So I decided I was going to go all in on this, and was going to use it as an opportunity to travel to a place that I had lived and hadn't been able to go back. And so I was like, I'm just going to choose whatever continuing education event is happening on this weekend when I can get away, so I can go to this area. You
Yep.
can tell, very strategic approach, right? Well, I was exceedingly fortunate in that it was an ACT training led by a phenomenal trainer. And those 3 days completely changed my approach to the work that I do, to the research that I do, and really to so much of my work as a leader. Um, and gave me some incredible tools in my life as a human being.
Hmm.
And so I don't mean to suggest that everyone is going to have that kind of experience where CEs change your life. I do know it's possible. But if nothing else, I think continuing education is going to help you build a toolkit that will serve you well, and keep that toolkit kind of up to date so you're not using rusty tools.
Yep.
um, Connect you with other people who share similar interests, and hopefully just bring another layer of richness to the work you're doing with your clients, because it can be exhausting
Hmm.
seeing 6, 8 clients a day. And I think for many of us, it's easy to fall into a rut. No matter how much we love the work, when you're doing the same thing repeatedly, that can begin to feel uninspired. And what I find is that when you find the right continuing education course, it can just breathe new life into the work you're doing, give you new things to try, like create experiments that you can do based on what you've learned. Some of which are likely to be helpful and you'll want to continue to do them. Others you'll learn are not really you or not really effective for you. Um, but all of that is valuable, and all of that I think is kind of mentally engaging and helps us stay more deeply connected to the work because we are continuing to evolve in our
Totally.
identity as clinicians and in the work we're doing.
I know I'm gonna get DMs about this, so I'm curious if you're open to sharing who like taught or facilitated that
Yeah,
ACT training. Yeah.
yeah. Rhonda Merwin, who is or was the president of the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science, which is like the parent organization um, for ACT. And it was a general introduction to ACT course.
Yep.
But a lot of her work currently is on ACT for eating disorders. So
Very
when
cool.
people have that interest, I definitely recommend checking out her work because it's really quite inspiring. So I remember so clearly because I had very little exposure to anything remotely behavioral in my training. Like I was
Hmm.
very psychodynamic, relational, feminist. Like that was my background. And I remember watching her do real plays with other folks from the training and being like, I have no idea what she is doing or how she's doing it, but I want to be able to do that.
Yep.
Like whatever that is, I need to know how to do it. And she's certainly not alone in the ACT people who have really inspired my work and who I have seen kind of bring their own version of a presence and an attention into the therapy room that I really try to emulate in my work. So highly recommend ACT and ACT training for people who are interested in potentially finding that like happy medium between behaviorism and some of the more insight oriented work where you can really bring yourself into the work and have some powerful tools to support it.
Totally.
So that was my little infomercial for ACT.
After you did that first ACT training, has most of like your continuing education and professional development really been like getting more deeply skilled in that area, or do you kind of bounce around a lot still?
No, I would say like I used to joke with my partner that like if I could, I would go back to graduate school and study in a program under a mentor who was, a behavioral, um, contextual behavioral scientist and really had that mentality. My partner, having already lived through one PhD, was not on board with the idea of another one.
Absolutely not.
Yeah, that was not going to happen. And so, really, what I've done is just take as many courses. I've done the ACT boot camp. I've done worked with a number of different trainers, online and in person. And then there was a really fun point at which I became a trainer. and spend lots of my time currently providing training, particularly within the Alma community, on ACT. But that's it. Kind of fits with my personality. I'm one of these all in kind of
Yeah.
people. But other people just really like to explore and like to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and kind of get as much exposure to a variety of approaches as they can. And I think that can be equally workable. In some ways, it needs to be a reflection of who we are and
Yeah.
how we approach the work. And that's certainly been the case for me.
I think it's sort of like that middle balance between wanting to be skilled in different areas. And I guess where I see therapists get into trouble sometimes is feeling like if they just get one more certification, if they just do one more training, if they just had this one thing,
Yeah.
that then private practice would be easier, that then they'd feel confident as a therapist. And so I think it is sort of like this tricky balance between, exploring what interests you for sure and like always trying to improve as a clinician, but not expecting that there's one thing out there that's going to be that like magic bullet that's going to make being a therapist in private practice so much easier.
Mm-hmm.
And instead really realizing that sort of comes from within. It comes from that confidence. It comes from that ability to show up, to be certain with who you are, to bring that to your sessions with clients more so than, any EMDR training or ACT
Yeah.
training or CBT
Yeah.
or whatever that you can add to your resume or credentials.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I would add is that the letters we have after our name or the certifications we may display on our profile or our web page may be helpful in terms of bringing people to us. In my experience, they don't make people stay with us.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yes, we want to bring new clients into our practice and marketing ourselves and our expertise, sometimes through these kind of externally validated sources,
Yeah.
can be important. But at the end of the day, your client isn't going to care about that. Your client is
Totally.
going to care about who the person who is sitting across from them is, what is the quality of their attention,
Yeah.
how do they relate and connect and find that kind of unique chemistry. And so, I'm not suggesting it isn't helpful to do that kind of applied learning that might get you a credential or whatever. And the question for me will always be, is that going to help you become more of who you want to be
Yeah.
in the therapy room? Because that's what you need to do, in my mind, is become as much of the person and the therapist you want to be as possible, because your clients will feel that. They will
Totally.
pick up on that. Yeah.
I think that authenticity is so important. I always say I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm like the only time I've ever talked about that with clients is when people have called me doctor and I've had to correct them and explain I'm not a doctor, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And then they ask, what is that? You're still a therapist, right? Yes. Okay, moving on. But that's the only time literally
Yeah.
that I've ever talked about my credentials or what I got my master's in or my license, because I find that clients truly don't care. They care that you're competent at helping them. They care that they're making progress and work together. They care that they connect with you and they feel comfortable talking to you. And to me, I think that getting the skills to be able to do that is the most important piece.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think many therapists who have lots of letters behind their name and have done a lot of training can't actually explain very clearly why they do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like why you made that choice, or you're asking for this thing in session, or you're engaging in this particular way. And I think that's the kind of communication that is actually very impactful to
Yeah,
our clients and actually establishes us as an authority
totally.
and an expert, is being able to, in language that a client will understand and find useful, explain, like, this is the way I think about what's going on here. This is the way I think about what will help you change or grow or recover. Um, and and I think having that knowledge can really do a lot in terms of building faith and trust in a
Totally.
therapist when you engage your client in that way.
It sounds like almost using that as like psychoeducation for the client versus like your credentials.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you find that therapists can sort of stay motivated to prioritize professional development and supervision when they're busy with their practice and sort of have a lot of different things going on?
I think as therapists, we're really good at telling our clients what they need to do to set themselves up for success when it comes to behavior change, whether
Mm-hmm.
that's, we are helping them to practice better sleep hygiene or to exercise or to eat right or to take their medication or just to get out of bed in the morning, right? We
Yep.
know how to do that for other people. I think sometimes we forget to do it for ourselves. And that to the extent that we just rely on willpower, that like somehow when you are busy going through your week, that you are going to have the internal strength to do something hard. I think you missed an opportunity, and that is to let your environment help you to do the things you want to do. So what might that look like? It might look like signing up for CEs 3 months in advance or six
Yep.
months in advance. So you kind of know what your calendar is going to look like. You don't have to make any decisions. You just know that, I'm going to do one CE course every 3 months, and I'm going
Yep.
to plan that out in advance. It might look like having a peer consultation group where, every 2 weeks you're going to have this in place and it's going to help engage you in sharpening your skills. Or it could look like blocking an hour a week for reading time, right? Where
Yep.
you save all those articles or, the things that you encounter that look interesting, but you just don't have time to actually sit down and read in the middle of a busy day. And you set aside some dedicated time, and that is just going to be your time to explore the clinical areas that you're curious about or that you're learning about or that you kind of want to lean into. Um, so really, I encourage therapists to do what we encourage our clients to
Mm-hmm.
do, hopefully, which is use their environment to help support the kind of behavior and the kinds of patterns that they're trying to build.
Yep. I love too. It's like not relying on the motivation to make it happen, right? But setting yourself up with specific actions beforehand that are going to
Yeah,
make you successful.
yeah. Willpower is highly questionable, right? Like sometimes we have access to it, other times, no matter how hard we try, we just do not.
Totally.
So,
And,
yeah,
it's hard too because that's super like self-directed unless you're part of, an individual or peer supervision, right? Like you're not really accountable to anybody if you're logging into your platform and taking your CE course or sitting there and reading. And so it can be easy to say, let me override this time with a client session or catch up on emails or, take my dog for a walk or whatever. But I think having that time and sort of that self discipline to say, this mattered to me, I put it on my calendar for a reason, sort of thing is super, super important.
and knowing yourself. Like I know myself well enough to be able to say, I will not concentrate the way I need to if it's a video asynchronous
Yeah.
course. Like I need live training in
Yeah.
order to feel fully engaged and to learn effectively. That's true for me. It's not true for everyone. And so, you figure these things out about yourself along the way. And I think it's important to kind of honor them and to really set yourself up for success.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I've learned about myself is I'm not an evening person. Like
Yeah.
I had signed up for like a year-long professional development program that was from like 5 to 8 p.m. on Mondays. And I was just like, Mondays are already so hard. And I'm
Yeah.
sitting here, I'm like not interested. I'm embarrassed to say this, but I'm like going camera off and cooking dinner during it. I'm like, I
Yeah.
just can't, right? And so now I'm like, I do everything in the morning when I'm fresh before I'm like tired from the day. And that's sort of what works best for me. And so sometimes you have to learn that with trial by error
Yeah.
too.
Totally. Totally. Yeah.
What does like sort of the trainings and professional developments look like that Alma offers?
Oh, our continuing education team is amazing. Like we are so fortunate. The way we've structured it is that we have clinical interest groups, and so I'm probably not going to remember all of them, but we have cognitive behavioral therapy, we have ACT, we have psychodynamic, we have a trauma focused group, a child group. So a variety of different kind of clinical focus areas, and then every every quarter we have a variety of different continuing education options within that kind of under that clinical interest umbrella. So
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow there is going to be a training on DNAV, which is an application of ACT to work with children.
Very cool.
So people can take advantage of that. I know we're doing training in the winter that will focus on working with individuals who are blind and vision impaired, which many of us as therapists have not necessarily developed a skill set that would prepare us well. And so
Yep.
there's a very unmet need. Um, so there are a wide variety of different topics, loosely falling within these clinical interest areas. And then we do things like case consultations so that you learn about a particular modality. We'll say DNAV. You might do a couple sessions of training, and then you have a case consultation experience where you're actually seeing the trainer apply the technique to a real case that one of the participants has submitted. So we try to make it really experiential, because I think the worst thing you can do is engage people in sitting and passively receiving information and expect
Yep.
them then to go and take that into their therapy room and all of a sudden be able to apply it. And so the more you can keep training active and applied, I think the more effective you're going to be in getting people really kind of proficient in using some of these tools.
Very cool. And are those trainings just available for Alma members, or can folks outside of Alma
Currently,
sort of
they
take
are
them?
they are only available to Alma members, and they are free for
Oh, that's
Alma
super cool.
members. Yeah, so they have access to live courses, and then we have quite a library of courses on demand for people who learn well that way. We've already established that I'm not one of them.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Cool. So, kind of to close out and wrap up for today, I'd love to ask you one last question. So, how do you kind of suggest that therapists balance this desire to continue to invest into their clinical skills and really trying to be the absolute best therapist they can be, while also saying, I'm ready for private practice right now. My clinical skills are good enough. I'm still deserving of being like in the therapy room with clients, kind of on my own?
Yeah. I think if someone were to come to me and ask me that question, I would know everything I needed to know. Like, just the fact that the person was asking and
Yep.
thinking about that would mean that there was both, an intention and a sense of humility. And
Yep.
and I think, I don't care how long you've been in private practice, like, you will never have arrived and be the finished version of yourself as a therapist. And so, I talk a lot about imposter syndrome because it seems to be very much a concept that people resonate with. And I have mixed feelings about it, because everyone is an imposter when they start to do something new. There
Yep.
is always going to be a time where you don't fully know what you're doing. And to the extent that we can embrace that and say, I'm going to show up and begin to practice these things that are maybe new to me and maybe unfamiliar and maybe challenging. Um, I'm going to I'm going to give myself access to the resources that I need
Mm-hmm.
in order to continue to grow and develop. But at the end of the day, I value myself, my clients, and this role in a way that I'm willing to take a leap. And taking a leap is always scary, right? I would never recommend anyone take a risk unless it was in service of something they care about deeply. And
Totally.
when it comes to going into private practice, it is a risk, and most people do it because there is something that they care about deeply in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really becomes about making sure that you have the supports, the resources, the opportunities for development that you need in order to grow and expand.
Amazing. I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This is such a valuable conversation.
Thank you for having me. What a treat to get to chat today.